Here we are, already on chapter 9, campaigns and voting behavior. It is said, this comes straight out of your text, it is said that the presidency is the most difficult job in the world, but getting elected to the position may be even tougher. I don't know if you've ever watched any of the campaigning relative to the presidency, but they're basically on the campaign trail for 2 years, and there's a lot of footwork that they do even before that. There's not one campaign that they're running in, but there's really two. It's a long and arduous process. Why are there two campaigns? We will get to that. But here are two views, that should say, two views of this idea that this process should be so long. So the first view, some scholars believe it is important that the presidential candidates go through a long and difficult trial by fire. If they can't handle the campaign for 2 years, how is it that they're going to handle the most difficult job in the world? That's the thinking. The other view of scholars is, if it's so difficult, with it being so difficult, this view worries that politicians with other responsibilities and individuals who would be competent and capable individuals just won't take a run for the White House because of the other responsibilities that they hold. And that seems true as well. So the reality is there's truth in both of these views. I really don't think we get the best and the brightest people running. Not that they're not capable and competent, but are they really the best? That's given this reality, it's difficult to say if that is really true. But there it is. Those are the two views as to this long and arduous process of running for the presidency. Another issue related to this long, arduous process is what Anthony King argues. He says that politicians do little governing because they're always running scared, too concerned with the next election to risk fundamental change. So they're not only concerned with the next election to risk fundamental change, but since there is this next election, they're always campaign funding. They're always looking to raise money. And so because of that, there's little governing, and because of that, there's fundamentally little change from one election to the next. So we have a system, in part because of the way we elect candidates, we have a system in which it's a conservative system where change is slow. Change happens slowly, in part because of the way we elect our politicians. Now, there are over 500,000 elected officials in the United States. Your text says someone somewhere is always running for office. And while that's true, while there's this many elected officials, what your text does is they examine the campaign for primarily running for the presidency, is what they're going to look at. It is the most visible of the offices. It is the one that we are all most interested in. Some of the realities of campaigning for the presidency lap over into other offices, particular higher offices such as the Senate, to a lesser extent, the House of Representatives. But the text is fundamentally going to examine running for the presidency, not the other offices. So in running for the presidency, there are two campaigns that a candidate will have to go through and win in order to become president of the United States. The first is the primary election. This is the nomination election for a party as to how they will choose their candidate, or who will be chosen as their candidate. So this is the primary, or it is a nominating election. Generally, in the public, most people will refer to it as the primary convention. Your text calls it that, but it also calls them nominating elections. And that's basically what a primary election means. Then whoever wins the nomination for the Democrat, Republican, or whatever party will enter the general election, which will determine who the elected official will be. So I'm just turning briefly to a PowerPoint that I've created on this whole primary general election nominating system. So in the United States, how is electing? And I hope this won't be on your test, this portion, but I specifically with specific questions, but I hope it will help you in understanding what's going on. So how is electing the President of the United States done? There are actually two elections, not just one, as we just stated. The first election is the primary election, or as your text calls it, the nominating elections. That's what's happening in the primary election. Somebody is chosen to be the nominee of a party's election. Okay, so the primary election, and this is true of Senate and House of Representatives, of governors, all this kind of stuff. So the primary election is the election that will decide who the presidential candidate or senator or governor or whoever will be for a political party's the candidate for a political party. So now let's take a look. I created this when Obama was president and he was running for his second term. So when you have a strong president, this is what happens. There's usually only one person that is a serious contender in this primary or nominating election, and that is the President of the United States. So Barack Obama was the only serious contender during this time. The Republicans, on the other hand, this is what it looked like. It looked like this. There was a large field, and this is actually, by today's standards, relatively tame. So there was about 9 serious contenders for the Republican, in the Republican primary. And of course, it winnowed down until you had one individual standing, and that was Mitt Romney. So that is the process of a party selecting its nominee for the general election. So I hope that's helpful. All right, so back to the PowerPoint that specifically comes from your text. All right. Once you go through this primary election and an individual is identified as who will be the party's nominee, you go through a nominating convention. Now, the nominating convention hasn't always been like it is today. It has evolved just like everything else in politics. And what happens at the nominating convention is states meet to cast their votes to determine who will be the party's nominee. It hasn't always been this way. We didn't even used to use nominating conventions. So from the 1830s to 1960s, most delegates at these conventions were elites who were controlled by party bosses. So the party bosses were really selecting the candidate for a party, not so much the individual voters. But in the early 1900s, presidential primaries were promoted that would take the nominations out of the hands of the party bosses. This happened for state level offices as well, but only 15 states adopted this policy of choosing the presidential nominee by taking it out of the hands of the party bosses. So that was what was going on in the early 1900s. Then in 1968, something disastrous happened for the Democratic Party that would facilitate change in this process that we've described right here in this nominating convention, where now this nominating convention would truly be in the hands of the people. So in 1968, this was an elite-dominated, closed-door procedures for selecting the convention delegates who would then select the party's primary nominee. So I'm going to put a YouTube video up under this lecture that will show you what happened at the 1968 Democratic Nomination Convention, so you can get a better idea of what happened here and how it facilitated change. You don't have to watch it, but it is very helpful in understanding. So what happened was there was a lot of individuals pushing for change. Vietnam War had heated up. You had a lot of young people who were had already turned against it, and they came to Chicago as well as other people, and they were pressing for change for an anti-war candidate. But they were basically beaten up in the streets by Chicago police and defeated at the convention, meaning this anti-war faction, the Democratic Party, was defeated at the convention. And they chose a candidate that was not anti-war. This faction, the anti-war faction of the Democratic Party, got one concession, and that was from this whole process that they went through and from the protests. That was there would be a committee of inquiry as to how the presidential candidate was chosen and who really controlled that and who really had a say. So after this review by this committee of inquiry, which would become known as the McGovern-Fraser Commission, and concerning what had happened in the 1968 Democratic Convention, this is what the McGovern-Fraser Commission famously concluded. Meaningful participation of Democratic voters in the choice of their presidential nominee was often difficult or costly, sometimes completely illusory, and in not a few instances impossible. So the McGovern-Fraser Commission concluded that the people, the rank and file people of the Democratic Party, oftentimes had no say in who their party's nominee became. And so because of that, there was real change, and a new system was developed. New rules were put in place by the Democratic Party to make them more representative and open to input from the public. So some of those rules were that all delegate selection procedures were required to be open. The college student, i.e., a younger voter, had as much chance of and as much clout in this process as an elected political official. There would be no more behind closed doors decisions, which would ultimately determine who the party's nominee became. Based on these new rules that were established, the easiest way it became clear to select the party's nominee was through the primary, the primary vote. And so that's what happened. So today, both in the Democratic and Republican parties, by the time you get to the party's national convention, which is the official one who selects the party nominee, it is really a rubber stamp as to what has already happened in the primary. That's what happens. So few developments have changed American politics more than this open primary presidential nominating process to the millions of voters instead of just a handful of party elites. So there's only really one remaining remnant of this old elite-dominated system at the Democratic Party, and that are what is known as superdelegates. And these superdelegates are elected officials who automatically get a position at the convention as a delegate. The difference is those delegates only vote if there's a deadlock at the convention. So you can see here that based on this statement, you can see that this new way of the Democratic Party gets their nominee by the primary vote is not completely true. Yes, it is true most of the time, but if there is a close vote, it could go to these superdelegates. So when Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton were going each other, both trying to become president after George W. Bush, it was a very tight race. Very tight race. Eventually, obviously, Barack would win. But in that case, these superdelegates were going to make a difference. There's something known as the invisible primary. It is something that happens before the actual primary. It's called invisible because it occurs mostly out of the public view. So before a candidate actually gets into the primary, there's a lot of work he or she has to do. They've got to build relationships and positive impressions from individuals who really have the money to donate, which will enable the candidate to run a viable campaign. And so the most important component of winning support is to win this invisible primary. So you've got to win support from elected officials, governors, members of Congress, the big donors, the skilled political aides. And if you can't do that, you will not be able to raise the money. And the individual, the candidate who raises the most money is said to win this invisible primary. It just gives them so much an advantage. It shows that big money is behind them because they have been able to win support of these elected officials. So when a governor endorses a candidate in the primary election, that is good for the candidate because that is going to bring more money into their war chest of funds to be able to actually even run. All right, so you've got a number of candidates. They've impressed somebody somewhere, and they begin this run for the presidency. So by history and tradition, Iowa is the nation's first caucus. Now notice I say caucus here and not primary. So a caucus is a method for selecting the party's delegates in which voters attend an open-air meeting, and that open-air meeting might be indoors, and they express who they want the presidential candidate to be. So a caucus is a meeting, and it's just done instead of by vote with a ballot. It's just done by voting by standing up and saying, "Hey, this is who I want," and you're trying to attract people to your side. And then at the end of the night, they take a vote, and whoever gets the most votes wins that precinct of that caucus. And then the whole state is counted, and whoever has the most votes wins the caucus of that state. So most states don't do caucuses, they do primaries, where we vote in the traditional manner, we vote by secret ballot. That's what happens. But Iowa, it's a caucus, and that's not why it's important, but it's important because it's the nation's first contest as to the strength of a candidate. So you've got to win Iowa, or at least do really well in Iowa, to keep the money coming into your campaign. If you can't win in Iowa, the big donors are thinking, am I wasting my money here? Is this individual going to be able to carry the day, or am I just putting money down the drain by giving to this individual who doesn't have the strength to go the distance? And so that's why Iowa is so important for candidates. If they do poorly, they're at a disadvantage, not only the money that they get in, but also in media attention, which helps to dry up their contributions as well. But there is a problem with the Iowa caucus. And that problem is the individuals who go to the caucuses are not representative of their fellow party members in the state, much less of the rest of the nation. So these are the party activists who are going. So you have many of these party activists who are much more conservative on the Republican side and much more liberal on the Democratic side. And they relish in the fact that they are the nation's first caucus, first test of this party strength, whether it's caucus or a primary. They take it seriously. But since they are more conservative if Republican, more liberal if Democrat, the process here of electing a candidate tends to favor the more conservative and the more on the Republican side and the more liberal on the Democratic side. So in order to stand out in this environment, candidates have to espouse those views that, in a sense, are extreme. More conservative on the more conservative on the Republican side, more liberal on the Democrat side. If you don't, you're not going to win the caucus, and then you're going to be at a disadvantage of this media attention and contributions. Now, this comes straight out of your book, showing the significance of Iowa. So this is a cartogram, and if the influence of the caucus or primary were to be the shape of the United States were to be modified based on that, this is what the United States would look like. So look at Iowa, just this little state in reality, but it is by far and away just dominates the map as to its significance in this primary process. Now, New Hampshire, again, is also a smaller state. It's the second test of a party strength. And again, it comes in second place. So this idea that you have to do well in the early running is certainly seen here in this cartogram as to its significance. All right, so New Hampshire is the next test of a party strength. It is actually a primary, and it couldn't be more different than the Iowa caucuses. There's voting, there's all-day voting. It's your secret ballot. New Hampshire residents are much more moderate than are Iowans, and 50% of the electorate is independent or undeclared voters. They outnumber both the Democrat and Republican parties. Moderates, independents tend to go either way. Furthermore, undeclared or independent voters can choose either the Democratic or the Republican ballot on primary day. So because of that, there's a different feel that happens in New Hampshire. So candidates so you can see why New Hampshire is not as significant as Iowa, but is more significant than other states. If you can appeal to your base, and then you can reach out and grab moderates, that's a good sign for you. So candidates do well in Iowa and candidates do well in New Hampshire. Tend to, not necessarily, but tend to go on and win the party's nomination. So with Vivek Ramaswamy, he did not do well in Iowa. He knows this reality. He dropped out. This is in this primary election of the 2023 we're having. Florida governor, Rick, he did not do well in Iowa. He did okay. I think he came in second. But then he did not do well in New Hampshire. Was too far behind. And he realized there is no way I'm going to win this thing. And so he suspended his campaign as well. I'm sorry, not Rick. Ron DeSantis. Okay. Nikki Haley, she did not. She kept going. She thought, oh, there's a chance I can overcome that. She didn't, but nevertheless, we'll get there. All right, so third on the list of these caucuses or primaries is South Carolina. Both political parties protect this order of the primary or caucuses contest for a number of reasons. One, tradition. It's been that way for a long time. There's an established expectation and they're both satisfied with it, so they've protected that. One of the reasons also is candidates like it. It's easier to campaign in a smaller state than it is in a larger state. So in one sense, these smaller states are acting for proxy for the larger states, because candidates can go out and talk to a lot of people relative to the number of people in the state. Ron DeSantis, he went to every county in Iowa trying to convince people to vote for him. So you're able to reach out. And with South Carolina being third, there's this feel that we need to give the diverse South an earlier say as to who becomes the party's nominee. And this was in part the Democrats who wanted this. They wanted to produce a more balanced candidate, and felt that these early states, particularly Iowa, that was much more liberal or conservative, depending on which political party you belong to, created a more polarized candidate. And so they wanted there to be more say of the more moderate voter, and so this is one of the things that they did. Now, the larger states get frustrated that they don't have an earlier say in who becomes president of the United States as far as the nominee, particularly with the fact that there are still, in the early going, there's lots more candidates in the race. So larger states feel like if they had an earlier say, it might change the outcome. But the system has remained what it is, and it will likely stay that way for the foreseeable future. Okay, once winning the campaign, once winning the nomination, you've got to win the general election to become president of the United States. So your text states that today the campaign is an art and a science, and it's heavily dependent on technology. Just with technology, they've been able to track what people think, what issues they support, how to reach voters, how to get donations. And that has fundamentally changed from what it used to be. So TV is still the most prevalent method used by candidates to reach voters. That TV it still is. It's certainly moving to the internet, but that's what it currently is. So this is what Barack Obama said: "I am almost entirely dependent on the media to reach my constituents." It should say it. Let me fix that. It is the filter through which my votes are interpreted, my statements analyzed, and my beliefs examined. For the public, at least, I am who the media says I am. Very interesting statement. So he's recognizing the reality of how individuals perceive him is going to be in large measure dependent on the filter of the media and how that gets interpreted by the various press outlets and reporters. So interesting thoughts there. All right. Now, what do the candidates need to do in order to run? So you've got, and this happens at the primary level as well, not just the general election. So the internet now plays a major role. It eventually, I believe, will overtake television. I don't know about you, but I get most of my news from watching stuff on my phone as opposed to the TV. And I think it will take over in short order. But at the moment, TV remains as we said in this last slide, the prevalent method by candidates to reach voters. So here are some of the things that the candidates do with relation to the internet. They establish a website, and it will state their stand on the issues. It will link speeches. It will talk about upcoming events and where you can go and see the candidates. And very importantly, it will have a link to donate money. So it is now much cheaper to raise money online than with direct mailing. It used to be that you'd get a lot of direct mailing at election time, and candidates would be asking for money. So Barack Obama broke new ground on soliciting money. He got over 1 million people through the internet to donate to him. Very impressive at the time. It just blew the other candidates away. And Bernie Sanders took this to a new level. In 2016, 5 million people donated to his campaign for his Democratic nomination. Didn't win. He's just too far out there on the fringe. But you can see the internet is the direction of where this is going. And one of those reasons is because the computer has allowed for specific mailing lists to help candidates get contributions. They know, you'd be amazed what political parties have been able to gather about voters. If you contribute to one cause, you're going to go on a list. They're gonna have some idea of what you think ideologically, and you'll be targeted that way for campaign contributions. All right. So within the campaign itself, there are a number of key roles. There is the campaign manager, who of course manages the campaign. There's a fundraiser who solicits dollars, very important. If you don't have the funds, it's not going to happen for you. There's campaign counsel. There's a lot of election laws, a lot of laws you got to follow, and your campaign counsel has got to make sure you're following those laws and make sure you break them. Otherwise, you're going to have all sorts of legal problems in the future. Just ask Donald Trump. Okay, there's the media campaign consultants who try to get the most out of your media exposure and get you media exposure. There's a staff that they've got to put together in all 50 states to get you on the ballot in those 50 states. So states are really running the elections in their state. Yes, it is a national elections, but it's administered through the states. There are research and policy advisors in many different fields who will advise you as to what policies you ought to pursue relative to the issues of the day. There's your pollster. He's going to study by taking polls whether or not your message is resonating with the voters. Critical in today's campaign process. There's the press secretary who works to get you desirable coverage. He's going to work, of course, with the media campaign consultants. And you've got to establish a website in today's world, or you are just not going to go anywhere. Money and campaigning. Running for office is expensive, very expensive. And so candidates have to build this campaign chest in order to have a viable chance of running. TV ads are expensive. Travel is expensive. Having this staff that we talked about here is expensive. They don't do it for free. You've got a staff in all 50 states. That is expensive. So you've got to have money. There are small contributions, and it takes many small contributions to build up this campaign chest. One of the reasons there are many small contributions is because in the past there were large contributions, and people felt that individuals were buying political candidates, and so election laws were passed which prohibited just large donations from coming into candidates. So there's two methods to contribute to candidates. You can contribute to the campaign and to the candidates themselves. As an individual, you can do that. Or you can donate to groups that make independent expenditures to express a view that may aid a candidate's campaign. Now, it cannot be coordinated with the campaign, but the difference between these independent expenditures, they are not subject to the restrictions of these campaign finance laws. So that's the advantage for individuals who want to have a greater say and have lots of money. That's the advantage for them on that. All right. So where did these campaign finance laws come from? So during Nixon's re-election in the 1970s, there was the Watergate scandal, which there were some dirty tricks played by Nixon and his campaign, and it was really felt that something had to change because of that. It was seen by many as criminal, what he did. And so because of that, the Federal Election Campaign Act of 1974 was passed. And that set limits. That set limits as to how much money an individual could contribute to a candidate. So the requirements of the law basically said that federal candidates for federal office must disclose who contributes money to them, and they could accept no more than 1,000 per election. So in running for the presidency, an individual could have accepted 1,000 in the primary election and then 1,000 in the general election. So you could have, if you were so inclined, you could contribute $2,000 if your candidate, of course, won the primary election, moved on to the general election. Now, the McCain-Feingold Act, this was back in '74. The McCain-Feingold Act increased that to $2,000. This is a number of years later, 25, 30 years later. And so it increased the limit to $2,000 for each election. And then it indexed that sum to rise from inflation. So we don't need a new act every 25, 30 years. So now, today in 2018, the limit was $2,700. I'm not sure what it is right now in 2024, but you can see how it's rising with inflation. Now, the McCain-Feingold Act also allowed unlimited donations for party building activities. This is like getting out the vote drives, registration drives. This is known as soft money. So this was a giant loophole in campaign finance reform laws. It created a hole that you could drive a truck through, so to speak. But that's what it was. That's what it was. Okay. Now, the Federal Election Campaign Act also created a commission. So it created the FEC, the Federal Election Commission. And what were its responsibilities? It was going to be a repository for these campaign finance reports. Going back here, you've got to let somebody know, and that's who it is, who contributes to your campaign and how much they contributed, right? So this FEC, the Federal Election Commission, became that repository, and it enforced the limits of the law on these established on campaign contributions. So there is that limit. What happens if somebody donates more than that? Well, the candidate can get in a lot of trouble. That's what happens. So, who is this FEC? The Federal Election Commission has 6 commissioners. 3 of them are Democrats and 3 of them are Republicans. It takes 4 votes to take any action. So because of that, there is usually a stalemate and no action is taken. The beautiful thing about this is, since you've got a parity of Democrats and Republicans, do I ever think that one of these 3 here or one of these 3 here will ever break rank? And yes, I do. If something was so egregious that it just shocked the conscience, I think one of them would. Maybe 2 or maybe all of them would. But at the moment, that threshold has not been crossed. The FCC, and so because of that, most time there's no action taken. Okay, the FCC has made reports available, and here are 2 of the websites. I actually have them linked, although you're not going to be able to see. You're not going to be able to click on that in the video. But if you type this in, you can go and see who donated. It's really pretty kind of interesting. All right. So the intent of the McCain-Feingold Act was to remove the big donors, big dollars from presidential elections and politics in general. But people with a lot of money are smart. They hire good lawyers. and they found a way around the law. And that was through the use of 527 groups. Now, it's called such because there's a provision in the tax code that became known as. So, the FCC refused to impose contribution limits on these 527 groups as long as they don't endorse or denigrate a particular candidate. So again, lots of money can go through these 527 groups to really aid a candidate as long as they're not consulting with a candidate themselves. Okay? Now, 527 groups were partially restricted for 8 years. The law restricted corporations and unions from using their funds to pay for electioneering communications in the last 60 days. What do we mean by election communications? Electioneering communications. What if they run an ad that denigrates one campaign, one view, not even necessarily the candidate, because you can't do that. So the law restricted that. But then what happened? In Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission, so the FCC, they're going against them. In 2010, the Supreme Court ruled, it was a close decision, that it was unconstitutional restriction on free speech to limit this. So they ruled that unions and corporations could spend as much money as they wanted to promote political views, provided, again, that they did not coordinate their message with a candidate's campaign. So now you can advocate for or against a candidate based on the United States or Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission. So that has changed the nature of campaigns as well, based on this idea of First Amendment rights. Good ruling, really. Okay. Soon afterwards, after these 527 organizations, yet the 501c groups emerged as vehicles for unlimited political donations. The advantage with the 501c groups was the donor could remain anonymous, whereas the 527, they could not. The difference is these 501c groups are regulated by the IRS and not the FEC, the Federal Election Commission. So they don't have to report unless a donor gives money specifically for a political ad. So the only significant restrictions on these 501c groups are they cannot spend more than half of their funds on political activities. Now, a lot of these 501c groups have a lot of money, so it's a very limited restriction there. Are campaigns too expensive? Look at this campaign between Clinton and Trump in 2016. Clinton spent almost $1.2 billion. Almost. Trump spent not quite 800 billion, probably 725 billion. Is that too expensive? Well, it's incredible. It's incredible. What's to say too expensive? I don't know, but that's just a lot of money. Just a lot of money. In 2016, if you add up all the elections, $604 billion was spent. Now, does money buy winning? As you can see here from Trump and Hillary, Trump spent less, but still won, still beat Clinton. So it doesn't mean that money is the only factor. JFK's father, when he was running for election, this was back before election campaign limits as far as donations were concerned, and his father said to him when he came and asked him for more money, his father was well-to-do, he says, "I'll buy you the election, but I won't buy you a landslide." So his father understood that, you know what, money mattered, and he believed he could, if he donated enough money, win his son the election, but he wasn't going to just throw his money away. So in general, and so it's not true, but it's certainly true, money does not guarantee winning. But in most instances, the better spending candidate does, or excuse me, the candidate who spends more money does better than lower spending candidates. Okay, but just because you spend more, it's no guarantee, as Hillary can tell you. All right, what is the impact of the campaign? What does it do? A lot of candidates think that if they have a good campaign, it's key to their victory as a candidate. But the reality is, political scientists question whether or not that's true and the importance of campaigns in general. They see them as doing three things, really. They reinforce preferences, they activate individuals to contribute, and in some instances, there's some conversion. They win support. So that's what political scientists think candidates do. And you can certainly see that conversion is important, particularly when you consider moderates. And it's moderates who will ultimately decide who becomes the president in the general election. Now, lots of research has led to the condition that campaigns mostly reinforce and activate voters. They rarely convert. Despite what I've said here, they rarely convert, but they do convert some. So most voters pay little attention to campaigns except for selective perception, meaning they pay most attention to the things they already agree with. If you're a Democrat, you probably don't watch much of what Trump says. You probably watch what Biden says. I, as a conservative, do just the opposite. Thinking, okay, this guy checks the boxes for me, Biden doesn't. Party ID influences voting behavior regardless of the campaign. In other words, if you're a Democrat, you're just most likely going to vote Democrat. If you're a Republican, you're most likely going to vote Republican. This is why I've mentioned so many times the moderates, the independents. It's they who decide. So you've got to convert them in the general election to vote for you. Incumbents, and so again, this is where political scientists don't think that the campaign that makes that much of a difference. Incumbents, this is the individual who already has the job, the political job, the office, holds the office. They start with a major advantage. They've got name recognition, people know who they are, and they've got a track record. And so for those reasons, political scientists don't think there's a lot of impact on the campaigns. Now, particularly the lower level offices, that is more going to be true than the president. But there it is. All right, let me get rid of this. Conversion is going to be the most likely when there's a wedge issue. And these wedge issues are issues in which parties are divided. So parties will use these wedge issues in an attempt to get support from their opponent's camp and bring it to their own. So what's happening, particularly with the Supreme Court's ruling in the Dobbs case, that says basically that put abortion back to the states to decide. Democrats are going to use this to try to create a wedge for those moderate Republicans who favor abortion. And try and get them to come over into their camp as opposed to the Republican camp. Republicans, Trump is going to use the border to try and get moderate Democrats to come into his camp. So these are these ideas of wedge issues that the candidates use in order to try and get this conversion. Voter turnout. At the time of the Constitutional Convention, Americans were more likely to vote and in Great Britain. More individuals were qualified to vote than in Great Britain. Since then, America and basically every other democracy in the world has extended their voting rights, and so today, everybody in the United States, 18 or older, with the exception of convicts and non-citizens, has the right to vote. Despite this, the fact that America was the first country in which there was this major right to vote, American voting has declined relative to other countries. So in presidential elections, so in the USA in 2018, only 48% of registered voters actually voted. And you look at these other countries where lots more people voted. So we have a problem with voter turnout in the United States. Now, there are 4 reasons that help to explain why we have low voter turnout rate in the United States. One is the voter registration requirement. The idea behind the voter registration requirement, why don't we just let people show up on election day and vote? Well, it's to prevent fraud. What is going to prevent somebody from showing up to one polling place, voting, going to another polling place, voting, or coming back and doing that all day long, or coming back later on to the same polling place? If there's a registration requirement that you've got to be registered, then you're only able to vote once. So we put in registration requirements to prevent fraud. So that's one reason. That has actually, the negative side of voter registration is that it actually discourages voting, because if a person doesn't get registered, then they cannot vote. That is the problem. There's also voter fatigue in the United States. So if we go back to our chart here, voters in the United States not only vote more often than in these other countries, but they also vote for more things. In most of these other countries, you have one choice and one choice only to make, and that is which political party you're going to support. That's it. There's no president, there's no senator, there's no member of the House, there's no governor, there's no mayor, there's no initiatives. That's it. You decide all you decide is which political party you're going to support. That's it. So in America, we vote more often and we vote for more things. And we vote for so many things that when people look at the ballot, oftentimes they don't even know what's going on with an initiative or whatever. They don't know the individuals. We vote for school board, all sorts of things. And so there's this voter fatigue that takes place. There is a low stimulus to vote in the United States. We don't have left-wing socialist parties to keep out of office. We don't have right-wing fascist parties to keep out of office. And so because of that, the view is, and some people have said there's not much difference between the Democratic and Republican parties. That's not so much true anymore today than it used to be. That was the case, but today there's a real difference. But they're still not they're not left wing and they're not fascist. Now they might call each other that, but compared to what really left wing and right wing countries are, they are not. In addition, we also have midweek elections. Tuesday. I don't know about you, but I'm working on Tuesday. I get to work at 6:30, and I don't even get done till 8:30 on a Tuesday. So there it is. There it is. It's tough to vote during the midweek as opposed to if you had an election on Saturday. And so that's another reason why there's low voter turnout. The cost of voting. You've got to overcome the rationalization that your vote doesn't matter. It really does matter. You look in a big country like the United States, over 330 million people. Does one vote matter? And the answer is yes, it does. So in the Bush versus Gore election in 2000, it was decided in Florida by just 537 votes, and Bush won Florida, and because of that, he won the United States. So you've got to realize, you know what? My vote matters, even though it's just a minuscule amount. When you take a look at the whole picture. The most frequent excuse for not voting is they can't take time off work or school. And I've just explained to you, sometimes that is tough for individuals. Usually the way I vote is I do it by absentee ballot, or I try and sneak over at lunch. There's also the cost of becoming informed. You've got to learn about the initiatives. You've got to learn about the individuals who are seeking office, and decide which one you're going to vote for. That takes time and effort, and some people are not willing to do that. A high sense of political efficacy is also important. So this sense of political efficacy is a belief that that ordinary people that don't hold office can influence government. And if you have that belief that what you do matters, it is more likely that you will vote. All right, last slide coming up. Who votes? So this comes right out of your text. You can see here 18 to 24-year-olds. Percent voting in 2016, 43%. That was actually pretty decent. Particularly when you take a look at in 2014, it was only 17%. But then when you compare it to other groups, all of a sudden it doesn't look so good. So 65 and older, 71% of those people voted. So 18 through 24-year-olds are the least likely to vote. Another one. So education has an important factor in whether or not somebody votes. No high school diploma, only 34% voted. College degree, 74% voted. Advanced degree, 80%. High school, 52%. So you see here that education has an impact on whether you vote. And you just go down. Now, Hispanics have been called the sleeping giant. So Hispanics today are the largest minority group in the United States. They passed African Americans, a decade, 15 years ago, as being the largest minority group in the United States. Yet, despite that, Hispanics vote only at 48% in the 2016 presidential election, where African Americans voted at 59%. So Hispanics, least likely major minority group to vote. And because of that, they have been called the sleeping giant. You see that men vote a little less often than women, married more often than single, and it just goes like that. All right, I hope this has been helpful in doing your test, and I hope things are going well for you. And again, if you have questions, shoot me an email. We'll see you next time.